kind of the stories about the Celtic Tiger. I would argue, we talked about this a little bit earlier, about the degree to which what happened in the 80s and 90s is something really new. I think the fundamentals of the Irish development model were already there. And there may be ways in which, you know, it was tweaked and changed in certain ways, but the thing which always struck me about the late 1980s, when Ireland was in kind of the same place it's in now, it's a bit better off now, let's say that, was that there appeared to be no alternative. And here was a state that was producing engineers by the thousands. They were leaving the country, 80 and 90% of them, within a year or two of getting their degree in Ireland. But the state just kept doing it because there just didn't seem to be any alternative to that kind of an education policy, which was done in the hope that there would be new, at that time, new digitals. And everybody remembers digital for this part of the island, I suppose. That there would be new digitals to come in and employ those engineers. Well, as it happened, I think partly by accident, that did happen. Didn't happen as much here, but the influx of Intel and Dell and so on and so forth did in fact create that. But it was a kind of a continuation of many of the essentials of policy that had already been present before the 1980s and 1990s. And Ireland was very well set then to take advantage. Very briefly, though, what I would say, I guess, about that, and let me just check that my next slide is what I think it is. Yeah. Very briefly, what I would say about that, and have written about it in some places, is that what was happening is that you have two processes that are going on in this kind of an economy which is so foreign investment dependent. One is that there are very massive flows of investment, which in themselves constitute economic growth. It's almost a truism. If you get enough incoming investment, you have economic growth. And if we look at the figures of what was happening from 1994 to 2000, the degree to which growth of GDP and GNP was dominated by the inflow of foreign investment is very, very high, and foreign investment just in a few sectors. So there's years in which 60, 70, 80% of the growth of GDP or GDP is the flow of foreign investment. On the other hand, one could argue that the stock of foreign investment creates various kinds of distortions in the overall economy that make the eventual crash inevitable. Because it doesn't create, and I'll just come to this last point I had before about the flexible developmental state, it doesn't create enough other forms of dynamic economic activity that are linked to foreign investment. Now, Sean O'Hearn, in his work on flexible developmental state, and we had a bit of a debate about that in Politics and Society some time ago, made the argument, well, you know, the Irish developmental state hasn't gone away, but it's a new kind of developmental state, and he called it a flexible developmental state, in which it was kind of a matchmaker, I guess, if we're going to go back to the midwife and husband model, in that the Irish flexible developmental state had its sort of networking capabilities going in two directions. It had great networking capabilities with foreign capital of different kinds. And it was also in touch with all of these engineers that had been produced in Ireland over all of these years, and other, prospective entrepreneurs. And it was able to bring together these two forces in order to create a form of development that was kind of subsidiary to the Celtic Tiger, but which had its own dynamic. And Sean used the software sector as the main place where he said, this is going on, basically. There's all these young Irish guys, highly educated, but they're sick of working for Dell or Intel or whoever else, and they go strike out on their own. They create a new product, they become millionaires, and in that kind of a way, basically, this is a sector which is also growing the Irish economy. And he was making the argument that the 90s and the noughties were different from previous decades because there was this kind of new dynamic. I remember writing about and reading the figures back in the 70s and 80s for linkages between foreign companies and local capital, and the linkages were just so minuscule. It was crazy. If you looked at the cost structure of the Irish electronics industry or chemical industries, like 2% of material purchases were being done locally, possibly from other multinationals. And everything else was just being imported, and things were being put together. There was a little bit better performance in services, so there were more services that were growing out of this foreign-dependent economy. But Sean was making the point that the 90s was different because of that. And the argument that I had with him, or the debate that I had with him, had to do with the degree that was an essential feature of the new Irish, or supposedly new Irish accumulation model of the 1990s and into the noughties. And I was kind of arguing, well, yeah, that's happening in software, but it's only a little piece of what's happening overall in the Celtic Tiger, and that the Tiger was still very vulnerable to disinvestment because it hadn't created the kinds of other things which would carry forward the growth that was going on between 1994 and 2001. And I think that that's probably been borne out since then. So, what I'm arguing is that the real crisis has its origins in the period between sort of 2001 and 2004-05, in which foreign capital began disinvesting in very large amounts. That this was part of the beginnings, perhaps, of an international, of a global crisis in which there was insufficient demand for things. And I know that we're not supposed to talk about actual products anymore, that we live in a world that is ungrounded and dematerialized. However, I think many of us still believe that the real economy, which produces things, goods and services, they may not all be, material, tangible things, but it produces stuff, is still very important. And that what happened in the early 2000s was that this period of boom, which created the Celtic Tiger, which impelled it forward, largely through the production of stuff in electronics and pharmaceuticals and so on and so forth, came to an end. That flow stopped, and it turned around, and as a result, we see the initial fall in growth rates of gross domestic product and gross national product in the early noughties, which is the beginning of the end of the Celtic Tiger, and in fact, that's the end of the Celtic Tiger, is maybe 2001, 2002. And then what we have is the further crisis, the bank crisis, the debt crisis, which we all know about, which we've all heard about so much, which happened later on. And, I actually was giving some talks and lectures. It hasn't been that long since I've been here, as you indicated, around that period of time, and including these things that the Social Democrats had been doing in Eastern Europe, basically saying that, this Celtic Tiger is in a real sad shape because basically it has lost the central determinant of economic growth, which is foreign investment and the flows of foreign investment. And what's replaced it, of course, is speculation. It was housing and construction. And that was very clear from the early 2000s, unless people just didn't want to see it, just didn't want to look at the degree to which that was going on. So here we have some figures during that period of the turnaround of foreign investment and the flow of foreign direct investment and the position of foreign direct investment began to take a big turnaround in the early noughties, as they call them, which, as I've said, I kind of see as being really the crisis of the Celtic Tiger, even though it was largely ignored. And it was largely ignored because it was replaced by new sources of economic growth, just from the point of view of gross domestic product. Something else took its place, which hid the degree to which the economy was beginning to go into a downward phase, or if not yet a nosedive. So that growth rates went from 10% to 5%, and all of the pundits said, well, this is great. I mean, we're not going to have the crash. We're now, just going into this great sort of period of the post-boom economy, and everything's going to be okay. And that was the kind of story that was being told during those years. But it belied the fact that these kind of underlying things weren't being looked at. Sectoral growth changed dramatically during that period of time, and the allocation of who was causing economic growth changed very much, so that industry fell off dramatically. Construction rose dramatically as a source of economic growth. And of course, the part of the story that we all knew about was the rise after 2000 of private debt, of construction-based lending, and the way in which this came about. And in a way, this looks very much like a local manifestation of what David Harvey talks about when he talks about the fix. Now, I think that it would be a little bit too much like a conspiracy theory to say that, there were gnomes of Zurich or somebody who was actually manipulating this thing and making it happen. Rather, this happened because of the degree to which the neoliberal deregulated model enabled that kind of thing to happen. And there was money looking for a place to go, and the construction sector and the housing sector was an obvious place to be. And that story has been told by other people, and I know that a lot of other people know it much better than I do. But, it's quite clear that this new source of growth emerged after 2000. And it replaced, for a period of time, the essence of the Celtic Tiger, the essential center of the Celtic Tiger, which actually was about production, which was about foreign-based investment in all that stuff we used to hear about: pharmaceuticals, Viagra, Dell, Intel, computer chips. So there we have the story. Conclusions. I've already talked a little bit about dependent growth and the degree to which the model of boom and bust, I think, is very much one which follows the boom and bust of flows of investment flows, because the Irish economy has been so dependent on foreign direct investment for such a long period of time. But there's another story which is going on about the way in which the local economy becomes distorted. And that is what then led to this emergence of the speculative bubble that we all know so much about and hear so much about. So there's two growth paths, two crises, one which is an export-led crisis, one which is an export-led growth path, one which is a debt-driven growth path in a crisis, which comes about after it, but which hides the first one, which I'm arguing is more essential. I've already talked a bit about the fix that Harvey says it covers the crisis, but creates a new and more spectacular crisis. The fact that that spectacular crisis is